Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are in the world. My name is Herb and I'm an alcoholic. Welcome to our big book, 12-step telephone workshop. I believe today is June 12th, at least here in Los Angeles. And I would invite you to join me in prayer for an open mind. God, please set aside everything that I think I know about myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path in you, for an open mind and a new experience of myself, my brokenness, my spiritual path, and especially you. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. And we're looking at step 1, and we're looking at the first half of step 1 about addiction. Bill was very clear in his preface to the very first edition that our way of life might have its advantages for all. I'm confident he didn't know what kind of a prophet he was in saying that. The textbook and the process of the 12 steps has been used and is being currently used by over 100 different 12-step addiction programs. But more especially, as you know, and I will keep repeating it and reinforcing it, addiction is a problem, but it's not the problem. And Bill's prophecy about this process being a benefit to everybody is my experience that anybody who wants a spiritual awakening, whether they have an addiction or not, can utilize effectively this 12-step process. In the first half of the first step, we want to identify the components of why we're an addict, whatever our addiction is, and the benefit of it. Although you've come from a specific orientation in a specific 12-step program for a specific addiction, it will be a benefit to you if you really embrace the set-aside attitude and the set-aside prayer, so that not only are you looking at your primary addiction, but you're willing to explore being given the gift of an inclination anyway, or an instinct, or some information about any other form of repetitive behavior over which you have no control that's producing negative consequences. My definition of addiction. This particular telephone workshop is addressing a constituency of food addicts, people with food problems, having an allergy, like the doctor said, to food, meaning that there are certain chemical substances in food that triggers the phenomenon of craving. That's the doctor's opinion. Once you take the food of whatever it is that you're allergic to, using that term poetically, broadly, not scientifically, but just to use words to calibrate your personal experience. Once you take it into your system, you lose control. Now, maybe it doesn't happen every time, which makes it even more difficult. Like I had a problem with alcohol, but only periodically, not every time. And so we looked at the doctor's opinion, and then we looked at Bill's story, pages 1 through 8, and we were looking at Bill's story from the perspective of how he thought, how he felt, how he drank, and how he behaved, so that you could identify with those aspects of his story, not his story itself or his life's circumstances, certainly, but with him as a human being with an addiction problem. And he bottomed out on page 8. And we read that paragraph. Bill then picks it up at the beginning of chapter 2, page 17. There is a solution. He's given us his own story, which shows, number one, the deterioration and disintegration of his alcoholism. And that's what we looked at. We didn't look at the solution, pages 8 through 16, which we will when we do step 2. I want you to stay in, actually, the problem rather than the solution at this point while we're journeying through step 1. Although Bill does use chapter 2 to give us some hope, saying that there is a solution. I mean, that's the whole second half of his own story. He says the problem, of course, is the addiction, hopeless, as he says in that first paragraph on page 17. But then he says, what we have here is a fellowship where we have a common problem. That's one part that binds us together. The other part is that we have a common solution, and that's the name of the chapter. We can absolutely agree and join each other in harmonious action, the great news of this book. He avoided using the nomenclature good news. Back in the day, especially when he was in his Christianity with the Oxford group, the term good news was a synonym for the gospel. And he certainly didn't want to even indicate that, because he didn't want to connect us to the Oxford group, certainly, but even more broadly to any type of organized or traditional religion. But he gets away with, this is the great news of this book. On page 18, he talks about this being an illness. It engulfs all whose lives touch the sufferers. It brings misunderstanding, fierce resentment, financial insecurity, disgusted friends and employers, warped lives of blameless children, sad wives and parents. Anyone can increase the list. Just so that he is also giving a big outreach, an inclusive outreach of identification to the people who are reading this book, who can identify either as the addict themselves or possibly as the person in the family that is being subjected to the behavior of the addict. Because the chapter is, there is a solution. A person who is looking for a solution might come to that chapter and read it and identify with this. He has a wonderful couple paragraphs on page 18, which I encourage you to read, which talks about the qualifications of somebody who can help. Bill doesn't use the word sponsor in the big book. He does 10, 12 years later in the 12 and 12 use that word sponsor. So from 1939 to 1951, that word somehow came into the use in the culture of AA. But it's not here used in the book, but the italics on page 18 and the following paragraph give a pretty nice description of the profile of a sponsor. I encourage you to read and perhaps really embrace that in terms of your own attitude and understanding of what constitutes a good sponsor, being one and having one. On page 19, he says, so how are we going to present what has been so freely given to us? Well, we're going to talk about the problem, but we're also going to talk about a useful program, he says. This is the solution, the name of the chapter, and at the bottom of it, he talks about a shift in attitude. He's already introduced us to the fact that it's a body problem, and he has suggested a mental problem. He hasn't really expounded on that at all. But he says a shift in attitude is going to be very helpful. Tolerance of other people's shortcomings and viewpoints, and a respect for their opinions. Tolerance and respect. Well, of course, in step 10, he tells us our code. Love and tolerance. Love and tolerance. Love being the decision on our part to be caring. Tolerance on our part to be open and to be helpful. These are the attitudes which makes us more useful to others, page 20. In fact, he hammers it home here very directly. Our very lives as ex-problem drinkers, our very lives as ex-addicts, our very lives as food addicts who have found a solution, not just in terms of the equivalent of a diet in terms of body size, but as addicts who have found a way of life that have given their soul its life, given its heart its life, having a shift in the way we think and feel and behave, that spiritual awakening. That's really the point. Depend upon our constant thought of others and how we might help meet their needs. Again, that mantra that I've adopted as my word for the 12th step, help. A very short, concrete word. In my meditation, the wee voice said, drop the word service, Herb. It's too sophisticated. Use the word help because it implies dirt. It has dirt and earth in it. You will spend time. You will be frustrated. You will get tired. You will spend your resources when you truly help. Because he says here in the next paragraph, we have recovered, notice the term recovered, past tense, from a hopeless condition of mind and body. He's talking about the first half of the first step. We've been placed in a position of neutrality. There is a solution. That's the name of the chapter. It is the purpose of this book to answer a question specifically. Well, what's the question? See, the big book has wonderful questions in it. Joe and Charlie, in a very wonderful sense of humor, said, the book is filled with questions, and you'll recognize the question because at the end of the sentence, there's a question mark. Wonderful. But they said, then use the question as a stop sign and stop and ask yourself the question, what do I have to do? Notice, it doesn't say, what do I have to know? What do I have to feel? What do I have to say? No, it says, what do I have to do? This is a program of action. That's the silver bullet. That's the magic formula. Action. The man who took me through the steps in 1988, and you'll hear this more than once from me because it was so powerful. Willingness without action is fantasy. Don't tell me how willing you are. Tell me what your feet are doing. Your thoughts, your feelings, your intention, interesting but irrelevant. Tell me what actions you're doing. If you have problems with people talking too long on the telephone, that's a great way to bring the phone conversation to a conclusion fast. They will get off the line when you start asking them about their specific actions, because most people don't want to be held accountable. It is the purpose of this book to answer this question specifically, what do I have to do? It says we're going to tell you what we did. Now, he also says that there's a lot of ignorance around our addiction. Now, I can't even imagine the kind of ignorance that you all find with regard to food addiction. People's eyes, they probably just roll their eyes in complete disbelief, because most people, like, they used to think about alcohol as a moral or a willpower issue. I'm pretty confident that most people feel that about food, and it's not that at all. It's the same, absolute same vicious dynamic, maybe more so than alcohol and drugs. I think I've said in the past, and I'll continue to say it because it's my experience, I think the food addiction is the most difficult one to address. Not only is it pretty commonplace that it's sugar and flour that are the main culprits, but each of the people who have an addiction with food have different body chemistry. And therefore, there's not a black and white protocol. There's not one size fits all. Alcohol is pretty straightforward, stop drinking. Drugs, pretty straightforward, stop using. Gambling, a process addiction, pretty straightforward, stop gambling. Some of the other process addictions are not that easy to address, but we have to eat once, at least maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a day, depending on our body chemistry. And he says there's a lot of ignorance and misunderstanding. He does describe here moderate drinkers and heavy drinkers and the real alcoholic, and he's doing that because he wants to talk to the real alcoholics. The moderate drinkers, the heavy drinkers, the people that don't really have the addiction. They just need information and discipline. They don't have to do all of the work that an addict has to do. Our rooms in the 12-step are filled in AA, for instance, with people who are not alcoholic. They had a drinking problem. Maybe they got a DUI. Maybe they had an embarrassing moment. And then they enjoy the fellowship and they enjoy the moderation or the stopping of drinking. But they're not really alcoholics, so they don't have to do the steps. And they talk about going to meetings and put the plug in the jug. And it's rosy and good. No, it's just not my experience. My life did not get better until I found this nature of the allergy and then the obsession in terms of understanding and having an experience with the addiction, and then finally 10 years sober, getting a real deep experience with unmanageability, the spiritual malady, and really understanding the deep nature of the human condition. And beginning to find what I had been looking for in the monastery and in the psychology development and in the human development and even in AA. I never found what I was looking for in any of that, including AA. I'm saying that loosely because I did find the way into the steps through AA. It was totally accidental. Well, by a set of circumstances, if you will. You might benefit for yourself, but also in terms of understanding the progression of addiction, but also in understanding of other people in your life, or perhaps helping other people who you're working with to help with their own lives. This might help them if they read pages 108 to 110 in the big book, because I believe it's in the chapter to the wives. It talks about 4 different kinds of alcoholics in 4 different stages of deterioration and disintegration. All real alcoholics, but at the various levels of this progressive disease. And you might find that of some value to you. It's not part of an assignment, it's just extra credit, if you will, for your own benefit. And then Bill captures what Dr. Silkwood was talking about on page 21. In that first full paragraph, he said the real alcoholic loses control once he starts to drink. That's the key. Once you start to drink. Then he talks about the Jekyll and Hyde, a senseless spree, a series of sprees. And on page 22, he talks about in combining alcohol with drugs even, which is Bill's experience, which is Bob's experience. Not that they were drug addicts. I don't believe that for a minute. But they did use drugs in connection also with their alcohol use and their behavior. And he says our behavior pattern's different on page 22. Why does he take the first drink? This is the question. If it creates all this suffering, and after 2 or 3 experiences, common sense would say alcohol is the culprit. Common sense, and a normal person will quit with 2 or 3 really bad experiences at the most. Most of us had really bad experiences for 10 and 20 and 30, maybe even 40 years before we found a solution. He says we are equally positive that once he takes any alcohol, whatever, into his system, something happens, both in the bodily and mental sense, which makes it virtually impossible for him to stop. The experience of any alcoholic will confirm this. This is why we have given you the assignment with the worksheet on the body, not as a test, but as a prompter for you to take a look at your own personal specific history with regard to your addiction. When did it start? When were you aware of it? What did it include? What happened? How many days did you continue to abuse? And then how many days did you have abstinence? And then did you, in fact, pick it up again? Of course, we know the truth of that. And as I say, normal people with common sense, once they understood that alcohol creates a problem, would quit. And that's what he says here. These observations would be academic on page 23 and pointless if you never took the first drink. Why do we pick up? Why do we relapse? Setting the terrible cycle in motion. He says the main problem of the alcoholic centers in his mind rather than in his body. He's got many alibis, lots of rationalizations, but nothing legitimizes the havoc that the alcoholic or the food addict experiences personally, as well as in their family or in their social circumstances. And on this page, he introduces us to some vocabulary. On page 23, he says there is an obsession. All right, so what's an obsession? I asked you to look it up. Without a dictionary, my understanding and experience of an obsession, it's a thought. Not all thoughts are an obsession. In the morning, I have the thought of a cup of coffee when I wake up. I really enjoy a cup of coffee. That's what I have. It's a large cup. It's a 2-cup cup. But once I have that cup of coffee, I don't have any further need or want for coffee. So I have a thought of coffee, but not an obsession for coffee. An obsession is a thought over which we have no control. And in fact, it's a thought that we're not even conscious that we have. It's a thought that dominates our mind in such a way that there is no other thought. An obsession hijacks us. It takes possession of us without our permission and without our consciousness. When you hear in the rooms, well, if you have the thought of relapse, call your sponsor, go to a meeting, pray, be of service. Those are all wonderful recommendations for a thought. They're completely useless with regard to an obsession. You won't even know that you have an obsession when you have an obsession because you have an obsession. It dominates the screen so that there is no other picture and you can't see around the screen. All you can be is totally possessed by this obsession. That's why Bill talks about insanity in this section. If you look up the word in a dictionary and you look at the root of insanity, it's sanity, which is the Latin sanus, which means health, a sense of balance, appropriateness, perspective. And when you put an IN in front of sanus, in sanus, it just means not healthy. Insanity in the big book does not mean psychiatric or psychological. This is really an important definition, and I hope you can really hear it. It's important in step one because of this second part of the step one process. Something's wrong with our mind. Bill calls us mental defectives. But it's even more important with regard to step two, because step two in itself promises the restoring of our sanity. And you hear all the time in the rooms, well, I don't think I was crazy. And that is correct. In the dictionary sense, insanity is a psychiatric or psychological disturbance. Most of us don't have that. Some of us do. There's a lot of comorbidity, as they call it, professionally. But that's not the vocabulary in the big book. Insanity merely means, and we'll see it when we come to Jim's story, the person who put a little whiskey in his milk. On page 37, Bill calls that an appalling lack of perspective. An inability to think straight. What he's referring to is this obsession. Now, we can define it and explain it, but it's still really difficult to understand. And in fact, in the second story, is part of this assignment, closer to page 38, I believe, Fred's story, the accountant, he uses a wonderful term. He calls it the strange mental blank spot. I just love that because it captures my experience. I would casually start drinking after I had been not drinking for a month, not remembering why I quit and that I quit. I would just start again for no reason at all. I mean, I'm reasonably well educated and fairly intelligent. And my education was introspective education for over 20 years. Philosophy, theology, psychology, human development. What's wrong with me? Yeah. Every time I start talking about this subject, it boggles my mind. It baffles me. Again, this assignment has a worksheet, the mind worksheet. You might even look at that, looking at the questions, not to answer them in writing right now, but to understand that these questions are there for you to reflect on as you do this reading and as you review your own personal history. Because it's not about understanding the big book and quoting the big book and getting the answers right. No. I mean, there's some benefit to all of that, but the real benefit was when the man led me into the doctor's opinion and asked me to do a little autobiography of my drinking pattern. Especially focused on, did I lose control? How often did I lose control? When did I lose control? What were the circumstances? What were my thoughts about going and having that drink? I was going to have 2 drinks and go home. I was going to go to the party and have a good time. I was going to the wedding and to help celebrate. And all of those turned into just disasters many times. Going back to the phenomenon of craving. Now, because I'm periodic, and psychologists call that intermittent reinforcement, it didn't happen every time. Progressively, it got worse, but I couldn't see that it was getting progressively worse because of the mental blank spot, the obsession. Normal people think, like Bill says on page 23, that we will arouse ourselves from our lethargy and assert our power of will. The tragic truth is that if the person is a real alcoholic, the happy day will not arrive. On page 23, crossing over to 24, and I'll stop there, he has lost control. At a certain point in the drinking of every alcoholic, he passes into a state where the most powerful desire to stop drinking is of absolutely no avail. This tragic situation has already arrived in practically every case long before it is suspected. And now I'm going to read this one paragraph because it's in italics. It's clearly the heart of the matter here as we start unpacking the problem of the mind. So the question that you want to ask yourself when you're looking at and reflecting on your own personal history, did I stop and have a period of abstinence, whether it was 24 hours or a week or a month or a year or a decade? Did I have abstinence, intentionally quitting, intentionally controlling? And did I have it for a period of time? And did I pick up? It's not a trick question. I know the answer. You're here because the answer is yes, you did. But here's the real question then. What were you thinking, conscious of, and feeling within the 1 or 2 minutes just before you relapsed? What were you thinking, feeling, or conscious of, or aware of? 1 or 2 minutes, right there, right at the beginning. What were you aware of? What were you thinking? That will help you relate to Jim's story. He vaguely sensed he wasn't being too smart. That will help you understand and relate to Fred's story, who didn't think anything at all. He just began drinking again after a year of sobriety and a deep understanding of the nature of the problem and an experience historically of having extremely successful, strong will. And he relapsed without any thought at all. Those are the 2 stories that Bill gives us to demonstrate this obsession and the mental defectiveness, and to contrast them. Jim, who had some vague sense and some consciousness, and Fred, who had no consciousness at all and experienced that strange mental blank spot. The fact is that most alcoholics, I'm going to revise the vocabulary to addict. The fact is that most addicts, for reasons yet obscure, have lost the power of choice in drink. Our so-called willpower becomes practically non-existent. We are unable at certain times to bring into our consciousness with sufficient force the memory of the suffering and humiliation of even a week ago or a month ago, and I'll add to it, or a day ago. We are without defense against the first drink. This is the most important experience with regard to addiction. The phenomenon of craving and understanding and experiencing and identifying and connecting to that is really important. But if that was all it was, then just stop the behavior to stop the suffering. And since you have an experience of stopping but not staying stopped, this becomes now the most important issue with regard to addiction. Why can't I stay stopped? And we'll look more deeply at it in the coming sessions. We'll bring it to conclusion now. Please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. Thanks, everybody.